It took less than 4 minutes for Air France Flight 447 to plunge nearly 38,000 feet into the depths of the Atlantic Ocean, killing all 228 people on board. How could a routine overnight flight from Rio de Janeiro to Paris end in such a horrible disaster? The answers would not come easy, sparking one of the most challenging crash investigations in aviation history. On the evening of May 31, 2009, 216 passengers and 12 crew members boarded Air France Flight 447 in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. They settled in for the overnight journey to Paris, France, expecting an uneventful flight. Among them were honeymooners, business executives, scientists, and even a prince. The captain in charge was 58-year-old Marc Dubois, a seasoned pilot with over a decade of experience flying Airbus aircraft. First Officer Pierre-Cédric Bonin, 32, had significantly less experience, but was progressing in his career. An extra pilot, 37-year-old David Robert, was also aboard for the long journey. The three pilots would take turns resting in a bunk behind the cockpit. As Flight 447 taxied down the runway in Rio at 10:29 p.m. local time, there was no indication of the catastrophe ahead. The takeoff and initial climbing went smoothly. At 12:55 a.m., the aircraft reached its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean. The pilots maintained regular contact with air traffic control in Brazil and prepared to enter Senegalese airspace. Just after 2 a.m., Captain Dubois switched places with First Officer Robert for his scheduled rest break. Now, Bonin and Robert were at the controls, and Bonin was the pilot flying. Little did they know, their lives were about to be upended. Around 2:06 a.m., Bonin informed the cabin crew that they were about to enter an area of light turbulence. As Flight 447 skimmed the tops of clouds, the ride became increasingly bumpy. St. Elmo's fire, an electrical weather phenomenon, flickered outside the window. The pilots were navigating through stormy skies in a region known as the Intertropical Convergence Zone, where volatile thunderstorms often develop. While turbulence was not uncommon in this area, it posed risks nonetheless. At higher altitudes, a plane has less excess thrust and is more vulnerable to upsets. The pilots discussed diverting around the worst storm cells, but the options were limited. Flying above the storms would surpass the aircraft's service ceiling or maximum altitude. Descending was not ideal either, as it would add time to the lengthy transatlantic journey. With no ideal solution, Bonin and Robert pressed on, relying on the sturdy Airbus A330 to handle the choppy air. The first sign of trouble came at 2:10 a.m., when the autopilot and autothrottle unexpectedly disconnected and an alarm sounded in the cockpit. The Airbus had detected inconsistent airspeed readings and automatically reverted to backup systems known as alternate law. In this mode, some of the high-altitude protections were lost. Simultaneously, a heavy gust of wind caused the plane to bank sharply to the right. Alarmed by the sudden warnings and motion, Bonin grabbed the side-stick controller and made inputs to correct the roll. But the aircraft had become more sensitive to movements in alternate law. Bonin accidentally overcorrected, causing the plane to roll left and right as he struggled to stop the oscillations. At the same time, Bonin made the fateful decision to pull back on the side-stick and raise the nose up. Unfortunately, this was the exact wrong action to take, and it put the aircraft into a steep climb. As Bonin raised the nose, the plane rapidly lost speed. Stall warnings blared in the cockpit, indicating the wings were losing lift. But for reasons that remain unclear, the pilots never tried to recover from the impending stall. Bonin continued pulling back, eventually putting the plane into a fully developed stall. At over 38,000 feet, the engines did not produce enough thrust to power out of it. The aircraft stopped climbing and started plunging toward the ocean in a terrifying descent. As Bonin continued to pitch the nose up, the other pilot, Robert, grew concerned about their speed and altitude. "Watch your speed," he warned. But the warnings were too gentle, and Bonin did not respond appropriately. Repeatedly, Robert implored his colleague to lower the nose and stabilize the plane. Bonin was now completely overwhelmed as tension grew in the cockpit, still pulling back on the control stick. Robert urgently summoned Captain Dubois back to the cockpit, but precious time was lost. When Dubois arrived, a full minute had elapsed. The aircraft was still stalled and dropping fast. Dubois, who was not present for the initial upset, struggled to assess the chaotic situation. He was unaware that Bonin was holding the plane in a stall. 3 pilots were now shouting, and none fully grasped what was happening. First Officer David Robert yelled out, as rookie co-pilot Pierre-Cedric Bonin struggled to control the plane. "F***, we're going to crash, it's not true! But what's happening?" In the final minute of the flight, Robert briefly took over control and tried to recover from the stall by nosing the plane downward to try to regain airspeed to pull out of the stall. But the inexperienced First Officer Bonin also still had inputs applied, and their conflicting stick movements canceled each other out. The crew coordination had completely broken down. As a series of alarms continued to sound, someone said, "F***, we're dead!" Then Captain Marc Dubois spoke last with a simple pilot observation of 10 degrees pitch, and just 2 seconds later, Flight 447 slammed into the dark Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Brazil. From cruising at 500 miles per hour to plunging vertically in just minutes, the forces inflicted would have been unsurvivable. Data recordings captured the terrifying fall before cutting off abruptly as the A330 disintegrated into the depths. With no comprehension of what transpired in the cockpit, search teams could only scour helplessly for the destroyed aircraft and lost souls. Air traffic control first realized something was wrong when Flight 447 failed to check in at its next assigned route waypoint. Attempts to contact the aircraft went unanswered. Around 6 a.m., controllers sounded the alert that the plane was missing. Still, given the uncertainties, hope persisted for survivors. The shocking reality became clear over the next few days, as search planes spotted scattered debris and bodies floating in the middle of the Atlantic. On June 2nd, air safety investigators confirmed the wreckage was from Flight 447. After a lengthy search, the battered tail section was recovered with the Air France name still visible, erasing any doubts about what happened. Immediately, theories spread about how an Airbus A330, one of the most sophisticated planes in the world, could simply fall out of the sky. Lacking the flight recorders, investigators could only speculate about the cause, and some suspected a terror attack or structural breakup. But the mysterious disappearance captivated the world. How was it possible to lose a massive jetliner in 2009? And why had the crew made no distress calls? Within hours after Flight 447's scheduled arrival time passed in Paris, devastating news spread worldwide of its disappearance. Given the sudden loss of a modern airliner with no distress call, the specter of terrorism hung heavy during the initial investigation. Aviation authorities persuaded investigators not to jump to conclusions. Recovering the wreckage would be key to understanding how such an incident could occur. The investigation fell to France's Bureau of Inquiry and Analysis for Civil Aviation Safety, also known as the BEA. Their first challenge was locating the black boxes on the ocean floor nearly 15,000 feet below. This was uncharted territory. Never had flight recorders been recovered from such extreme depths. BEA Director Alain Bouillard knew it was a long shot, but crucial to understand why 228 lives were lost. Navies from France, Brazil, and the US scanned thousands of square miles of open ocean to pinpoint the crash site. On April 3, 2011, nearly 2 years after the disaster, an unmanned submersible finally located the main wreckage and critical recorders. When lifted onto a ship and dried out, the data chips miraculously still held the vital evidence needed to reconstruct the flight's final moments. Analyzing this data painted a clearer picture, but it left some questions unanswered. The pilots were not heard on the cockpit voice recorder mentioning the stall warnings or working through stall recovery procedures. While Bonin's inputs led to the upset, it was still unclear why a trained crew did not recognize and correct the situation. In July 2012, after a comprehensive 3-year investigation, BEA released its final report. The report determined that as Flight 447 went deeper into the storm, ice crystals bombarded the aircraft and caused the pitot tubes to freeze over. This caused warnings to sound in the cockpit, driven by a central aircraft computer called the flight director. One of its core functions is to continuously verify the agreement of data from the 3 redundant sets of pitot tubes and other critical sensors. With airspeed readings diverging between sensors, the flight computer could no longer determine exactly how fast the airplane was moving. These inconsistent airspeed readings caused the flight director to automatically revert the Airbus to backup systems known as alternate law, disabling the autopilot. In this mode, some of the high-altitude protections were immediately lost as control was given back to the flight crew. While pitot tube failure was not uncommon, the crew's incorrect response turned it into a catastrophe. Investigators concluded that Bonin had overreacted to the turbulence and unreliable speeds by pulling up, an unusual technique that ultimately stalled the aircraft. In the confusion and stress of the moment, the pilots failed to diagnose the stall or take proper action before it was too late. The design of the Airbus side-stick controls may have also contributed to the breakdown in teamwork during the crisis. The difficult recovery at high altitude highlighted gaps in pilot training. Following Air France 447, regulatory agencies mandated better training in hand flying, stall recognition and recovery, and upset prevention at altitude. Airbus modified the stall warning system to better match actual conditions. The entire aviation industry learned difficult lessons about monitoring automation and maintaining core piloting skills. While the investigation revealed missteps made in the heat of the moment, it was clear the pilots did not intentionally crash the plane. Air France expressed solidarity with the families of the victims, acknowledging that while progress had been made, the wounds would still take time to heal. The loss of Air France 447 stunned the world not only because of the mysterious circumstances, but the staggering death toll. The BEA called it one of the most challenging crash investigations in history. For victims' families, the anguish was worsened by not knowing the resting place of their loved ones. Closure only came years later when underwater wreckage and remains were finally recovered. In the end, there were no mechanical failures, terrorist plots, or freak weather events that caused the Airbus A330 to plunge into the sea. Just a briefly malfunctioning speed sensor, fatigued pilots, confusing warnings, and difficulty recovering in an environment where there was little room for error. The safest planes can still crash, and even good pilots can make tragic mistakes when thrust into totally unforeseen circumstances. While the Air France disaster revealed how precarious modern aviation remains, it also showed how far safety had progressed. Previous generations of planes and pilots would not have stood a chance under the same conditions. But lessons continue to be learned, training enhanced, and aircraft improved. The search for answers after Air France 447 moved the industry forward, so those lost would not have died completely in vain. The heartbreaking tragedy serves as an enduring reminder of our fallibility, despite advanced technology. By telling the story of Flight 447, we honor those who perished and gain wisdom to make the skies safer. For while the risks can never be eliminated, only through training our human capacity to match our engineering ingenuity can we uphold the sacred duty owed to those who entrust their lives to the vessels and systems we create. So what are your thoughts on this horrific crash? Was First Officer Bonin completely at fault? Or was it the combination of mechanical issues that led to the chain of events and the panic in the cockpit, including the inexperienced pilot's panicked errors? Leave a comment below. And also remember to subscribe to the channel for more disastrous tales, always told in honor of those who lost their lives. See you next video.